Spider-Man is easily my all-time favorite fictional character, just ahead of Sherlock Holmes. I believe he has an even better rogues gallery than Batman. Spidey's villains seem to have a more believable motivation. That being said, he also has some of the weirdest, kookiest, lamest, and silliest villains ever. Are any as silly and lame like the Condiment King? Well, let's find out.
This is starting to sound like a bad comic book plot. It gets worse.
First, the Big Wheel. A thief that drives a mechanized big wheel? Jackson Wheelie. This is gonna become a thing, isn't it? Well, anyway, he stole from his company and had the villain Rocket Racer steal the incriminating evidence for him. The racer extorts him instead. He has the Tinkerer make him a big giant wheel to kill the racer. Spider-Man eventually squashes their beef. I think it really says something about the lameness of a villain, seeing though he didn't appear again for about 20 years. Understandable, since this was a villain you could defeat just by tipping him over.
This is starting to sound like a bad comic book plot. It gets worse.
Next, the Wall. An angry baseball fan turned to the Green Monster? Or a Pink Floyd-inspired villain? Nope. A part-time laborer by the name of Joshua Waldemeier. Oh, God. While laying down bricks and concrete, he gets hit by an explosion. A wall falls on him and he becomes the lumbering, armless terror of the Wall. Well, after terrorizing a New York Mets game, Spidey beats him by just having a little chat with him. I don't know if he ever was able to change back to normal though.
This is starting to sound like a bad comic book plot. It gets worse.
Next, the White Rabbit. Lorena Dodson, a spoiled, bored socialite, lost her marbles after becoming a trophy wife and murders her husband, and since she always loved Alice in Wonderland, she becomes part White Rabbit from the story and part Playboy Bunny.
What?
It's as preposterous as it sounds. What's funny though is in 2011 during the DC New 52 event, they introduced a new Batman villain dressed as a sexy white rabbit only wearing a bra and panties. The thing is, DC actually tried to position her as a mastermind with a straight face.
This is starting to sound like a bad comic book plot. It gets worse.
Next, the Kangaroo. Frank Oliver was an Australian who lived and ate with kangaroos and gets the ability to leap just like them. Yep, that's how that works. After this, he becomes a boxer, of course, and goes on the run after accidentally injuring his opponent with a kick to the face. But before he could be deported, he hopped away and became a criminal. Some other things happened, but let's go to the second man to take the title of the Kangaroo, Brian Hibbs. He won up Frank by actually dressing as a kangaroo in order to commit crimes. I wonder what Stan and Steve will have thought about this.
This is starting to sound like a bad comic book plot. It gets worse.
Next, Pastepot Pete, aka the Trapster or just Willie. Well, Stan really did love alliteration. Look at him. And didn't say his name. There isn't any way you can take him seriously. Plus, he had a silly looking glue gun. The only reason why he changed his name from Pastepot Pete to the Trapster was because Spider-Man couldn't stop laughing at him after he said his name. Enough said.
This is starting to sound like a bad comic book plot. It gets worse.
Next, the Living Brain. The Living Brain was a computer that was made to answer any question. A couple of wannabe gamblers plot to use it for, well, you know. Well, one thing leads to another and it goes on a rampage and Spidey has to stop it. Isn't this like an evil version of Watson from Jeopardy? Well, anyway, years later after Doc Ock left Spider-Man's body, yeah, that happened. I know it sounds weird, but it was actually a good story. He wound up having his consciousness put into the Living Brain.
What? This is starting to sound like a bad comic book plot. It gets worse.
Next, the Ringer. He's a guy that shoots rings at people. Because of course he does. Anthony Davis was a former NASA engineer and became a criminal. During his initial run-in with Spider-Man, Spidey just cracks on about how lame he is. Wait, isn't that what he usually does? Anyway, his outing was so pathetic, I think Spidey took him out in like only 3 panels and was making fun of him in 2 of them. And now before I get to the number 1, kookiest villain, some honorable or dishonorable mentions. And now the number 1 kookiest, strangest villain is Swarm. Of course it had to be Swarm. Fritz von Meyer, a former Nazi scientist whose entire body consists of sentient killer bees. That's the most ludicrous, brilliant concept ever. This sounds like a stand power from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It sounds like a crackpot idea rather Carrie Bates would have put up in The Trial of the Flash. So yeah, Spidey has some really odd and lame villains, but after 50 years, what would you expect? In the future, I will do a list of his best villains, if for no other reason to prove that he does have the best rogues gallery in comics. So until my next video, have a good day.
Swarm is my master. I am a worker. I work for Swarm.
Everyone will work for Swarm.